The most revealing part of certain relationships is not the way someone leaves, it is the way they return. They come back with warmth, shared memories, perhaps even the tenderness you once waited months to hear. Yet they show little curiosity about the life that continued without them. They do not ask what their absence changed in you. They resume at the point where their own need was interrupted, as though your inner world had remained untouched and available in storage. Soon the old atmosphere reforms. Their confusion becomes language. Their loneliness becomes bearable. The tension they carried into the room begins to loosen, and you recognize how skilled you still are at making another person feel less alone. What is missing is harder to name. They are relieved in your presence, but they are not necessarily encountering you. That is why a reunion can feel affectionate and empty at the same time. They may remember your patience, your lack of judgment, and the way difficult emotions became manageable around you. They may sincerely describe this as missing you, but a person can long for what happened inside themselves around you without having learned to know the person who made that relief possible. Affection and use are not always opposites. Human attachment is often mixed. Someone can care for you and still relate mainly to the function you perform. They can miss your voice while also missing the regulation, reassurance, and forgiveness your voice once provided. The arrangement did not survive only because they benefited from it. Their need gave them a reliable way back to you, while being needed gave you a reliable way to matter. Every return relieved two fears at once: their fear of carrying distress alone, and your fear that without usefulness you might not be chosen. The question, then, is not simply whether they missed you, it is whether the relationship can still recognize you when you are no longer performing the role that made closeness easy. The relationship may not have begun through deliberate exploitation. Your attentiveness probably felt natural. You noticed what they struggled to express and offered the words they could not find. They experienced relief around you, and their relief made you feel close to them. A spontaneous act of care gradually became the condition under which the bond felt most alive. The change was almost invisible. They began bringing more of their distress and less of their ordinary self. Conversations gathered around what had gone wrong, whom they were angry with, what decision frightened them, or which loss they could not bear. You became important in moments of emotional pressure, but increasingly absent from the parts of life where no rescue was required. You may have known astonishing details about their inner world, while they knew very little about yours. You remembered what disturbed their sleep, which family conversation they feared, and what silence meant when it entered their voice. They may not have known what made you feel alive, what you privately mourned, or how much energy it required to keep receiving them. Knowing so much can create the sensation of profound closeness. Information feels like intimacy because it produces familiarity. Yet, you were familiar with their complexity, while they were familiar with your capacity. They knew you as patient, available, perceptive, and safe. You knew them as contradictory, frightened, hopeful, defensive, tender, and unfinished. The imbalance was not simply that you cared more. You were permitted to have a function, while they were permitted to have a self. Their moods could change the atmosphere. Their needs could alter the plan. Their uncertainty deserved time. Your presence remained most welcome when it was steady enough to accommodate those changes without creating equal demands. In Jungian terms, the persona becomes restrictive when a successful way of relating is mistaken for the whole person. Your reliable self worked so well that the relationship stopped asking who existed beneath it, because you could carry complexity without visibly collapsing. Others assumed that carrying it cost you nothing. Eventually, you may have begun making the same assumption. Competence concealed the price. You answered thoughtfully even when you were tired. You found measured language while anger tightened your throat. You made room for explanations that did not erase the impact, but somehow delayed your response to it. Every graceful reaction strengthened the belief that you would remain accessible regardless of what the relationship asked you to absorb. This is one reason people can return without offering repair. Your past responses taught them that emotional urgency could bypass unfinished accountability. A crisis restored contact more quickly than an honest conversation would have. Their distress became a temporary bridge over everything neither of you wanted to confront. Once they felt steadier, the bridge disappeared again. You may have noticed that serious conversations were easiest when they were in pain. In those moments, they could sound open, reflective, and unusually affectionate. Their defenses weakened because they needed somewhere to place what overwhelmed them. But after the immediate pressure passed, that openness did not always become a different way of relating. It became a memory you used to justify waiting. The relationship was sustained by intermittent depth. A few intense exchanges carried more emotional meaning than long periods of inconsistency. You measured the bond by what was revealed during their most vulnerable hours, rather than by what was practiced in ordinary time. The exceptional moment became proof, while recurring absence was treated as circumstance. This protected you from a difficult recognition. If ordinary behavior mattered more than emotional intensity, you would have to evaluate the relationship by what it consistently allowed. You would have to notice that being trusted with someone's pain did not necessarily mean being included in their life. You might be their refuge without being their companion. That position offered a peculiar form of importance. You were difficult to replace during a crisis because few people could receive them with the same patience. When they reached for you, uncertainty disappeared for a while. Their need announced that you mattered. Yet, singularity is not always mutual choice. Sometimes it means you became unusually skilled at performing a role others were unwilling or unable to perform. The arrangement may have been reinforced long before this particular relationship. Perhaps reliability earned praise at work, in friendships, or within a family that valued people who created little difficulty. Perhaps emotional restraint made you easier to trust. You learned gradually that usefulness produced a dependable response from others, while simply wanting closeness exposed you to uncertainty. No dramatic rejection was required. Social reward was enough. People thanked you for being strong, calm, generous, and understanding. They sought your judgment and trusted your endurance. Each compliment confirmed a valuable part of you, but it also made another part more difficult to reveal: the person who wanted care without first proving usefulness. Relationships then organized themselves around the strength everyone already recognized. You became the one who could handle the late call, the complicated confession, and the repeated dilemma, because you rarely demanded equivalent attention. People experienced closeness with you as unusually comfortable. They could reveal themselves without facing the full vulnerability of meeting an equally present other. Your restraint protected them from feeling inadequate, but it protected you as well. If you did not reveal the extent of your need, they could not refuse it clearly. You could preserve the possibility that they might have cared well if circumstances had been different. Silence kept disappointment ambiguous, and ambiguity allowed attachment to continue without a final verdict. This was not peace. It was a way of preventing the relationship from becoming fully testable. As long as you did not ask for what you needed, you could continue believing the bond contained more reciprocity than it had demonstrated. Potential remained emotionally safer than evidence, because potential could not directly abandon you. The cost appeared in the strange loneliness that followed intimate conversations. You had just been trusted with someone's deepest fear, yet your own life felt more invisible afterward. Your chest became heavy once the call ended. The closeness had been real enough to activate longing, but too one-sided to satisfy it. You were emotionally occupied without being emotionally accompanied. Over time, anticipation itself changed. Contact no longer carried the pleasure of a spontaneous encounter. It felt like an assignment arriving before its terms had been stated. Your attention began estimating the time, energy, and emotional steadiness the exchange would require before the other person had fully appeared. You were already preparing the version of yourself their difficulty would demand. Still, refusing felt disproportionate. They were not asking for everything at once. Each request seemed manageable: one conversation, one favor, one explanation, one more chance to be understood. The exhaustion came from accumulation, but every individual moment presented itself as too small to justify a limit. The pattern survived by arriving in pieces. The Jungian idea of a complex helps explain why the pattern survives without repeating through identical events. What returns is the same emotional logic: someone needs you. Your value becomes immediately clear, and belonging feels temporarily secure. Dissatisfaction arrives only after the attachment has been reinforced. By then, naming the imbalance feels like threatening the very connection your care restored. Resentment may have appeared and then disappeared beneath self-criticism. You became irritated when their name appeared and ashamed of the irritation. You wondered why you lacked compassion precisely when they were struggling. Instead of reading resentment as evidence of an unacknowledged limit, you treated it as a defect in the generous identity you were trying to preserve. What you could not express directly returned indirectly. You replied more slowly. Your warmth became effortful. You felt relief when circumstances prevented you from helping. You imagined being unreachable and then judged yourself for the fantasy. The shadow was not asking you to become cruel. It was carrying the refusal your conscious identity had not permitted. Because refusal remained buried, the relationship received mixed signals. Your words continued saying yes, while your tone carried fatigue. You offered presence, but quietly wanted the conversation to end. They may have sensed the withdrawal without understanding its source. Since the limit was never spoken clearly, both of you could interpret the tension according to your existing fears. They may have experienced you as unexpectedly distant. You may have experienced them as impossibly demanding. Yet the deeper problem was an arrangement that required neither person to speak the whole truth. They did not have to acknowledge how much they relied on access, and you did not have to acknowledge how much being relied upon protected your place. The difficulty becomes visible the first time you allow their urgency to remain theirs. Nothing outwardly dramatic occurs. You continue with your own evening instead of reorganizing it around the familiar request. Yet, internally, the delay feels larger than the moment deserves, as though the entire relationship is being decided by the simple fact that you have not abandoned your own life to manage theirs. Guilt begins constructing a case against you. You know how difficult their life has been. You remember the rare moments when they supported you. You hear the vulnerability beneath their request and imagine the disappointment your absence might create. The mind collects every reason to answer while quietly excluding the history that made answering feel so costly. This guilt does not necessarily mean you have violated your values. Sometimes it means you have interrupted a role that once protected your attachment. The old arrangement interprets interruption as abandonment because it cannot distinguish caring from immediate availability. To delay a response feels like leaving someone alone, even when responding would mean leaving yourself again. The guilt outlasts the decision. Long after you have chosen not to intervene, part of your mind continues rehearsing the rescue you could still perform. You are not merely deciding whether to help, you are tolerating the possibility that someone may form an unfavorable opinion of you, and that correcting it may require surrendering the very limit you are trying to keep. That is where separation becomes psychologically difficult. It is easier to withdraw when you can believe the other person is entirely wrong. It is harder when you know they are human, wounded, and perhaps genuinely confused. Their pain does not automatically make your access necessary, but recognizing its reality prevents the clean anger that might have made distance simpler. You may wish they would behave badly enough to justify your decision. An obvious accusation, a deliberate cruelty, or another undeniable betrayal would make the boundary feel legitimate. Instead, they may sound soft, they may say they miss talking to you, they may remember something intimate. Their tenderness reaches the part of you that still wants evidence that the bond was more than function. For a moment, the old interpretation returns. Perhaps this time they understand. Perhaps your absence has made your personhood visible. Perhaps what sounds like longing is the beginning of mutuality. But longing alone cannot answer that question. The answer appears only in whether they can remain present when your reality interrupts the reunion they imagined. They might ask why you have become distant and then listen only long enough to defend themselves. They might apologize for your feelings without naming their behavior. They might promise greater care while still treating your hesitation as an obstacle to overcome. The words approach you, but the structure beneath them remains organized around recovering access. This does not mean their affection is calculated. They may not consciously separate you from what you provided. In their experience, the two may have become inseparable. Missing your voice also means missing relief. Missing your presence also means missing the version of themselves that appeared when you carried what they could not manage alone. You may be inseparable from the function in your own mind as well. When you imagine returning, you do not picture an ordinary conversation between two separate adults. You immediately anticipate listening, interpreting, calming, and adjusting. The role enters before the relationship does. The imagined reunion already contains an assignment before affection has time to decide whether it wishes to be there. The deeper grief lies here. You may still want the person, but you no longer want the position from which you were allowed to have them. The relationship appears available only through a form of self-abandonment that has become impossible to ignore. Desire remains, yet the route toward it has become psychologically unacceptable. This is not the clean disappearance of love. It is love losing its old method of access. You may feel tenderness and refusal within the same hour. You may remember what was beautiful without being able to return to what made that beauty costly. The heart does not always withdraw simply because consciousness has understood the arrangement. The contradiction can make you distrust yourself. On one day, distance brings relief. On another, you miss them intensely. You may interpret this movement as weakness or indecision, but grief does not proceed according to the logic of a verdict. You are mourning a person, a role, a hope, and a future you kept imagining from their most vulnerable moments. What hurts is not only what happened, it is what almost seemed possible. Their openness during a crisis revealed enough depth to make mutuality imaginable. Their gratitude offered enough warmth to keep the possibility alive. You were not attached merely to their need. You were attached to the person who occasionally appeared when need lowered their defenses. That person may have been real, but reality in a moment is not the same as availability across a relationship. Someone can reveal genuine tenderness and still lack the capacity to live from it consistently. Recognizing this does not erase the moment. It removes the responsibility you assumed for turning that moment into a permanent bond. This is the distinction. You are finally able to hold. Someone can miss you deeply and still know only how to return to the version of you that served them. Their longing can be sincere, while the form of connection they seek remains unchanged. Missing you is not yet evidence that they are prepared to meet you. You may have believed that if you stayed patient enough, the temporary opening would become their ordinary way of relating. Your understanding would eventually make honesty safer for them. Your steadiness would teach them that closeness could be trusted. Without saying it aloud, you made your continued availability part of a private project of transformation. This is where the shadow complicates the innocence of your care. Being the one who understood gave you more than belonging. It gave you a quiet sense of influence. If your patience could help them become more available, then waiting was not passive. It was meaningful work directed toward a future relationship that had not yet arrived. The role also allowed you to remain morally clear. You were the patient one, the consistent one, the person willing to see complexity. Their inconsistency carried the obvious problem, while your availability appeared entirely generous. Yet generosity that cannot tolerate refusal may also carry fear, control, and an unspoken demand that sacrifice eventually be rewarded. This does not make your kindness false. It means kindness was carrying a hope it could not openly admit. You wanted your care to matter enough to change the terms of the relationship. When that change did not come, resentment exposed the hidden contract. You had given what was not formally requested and waited for the relationship to understand what the giving meant. Neither of you may have spoken the agreement because its power depended on remaining unconscious. They did not have to acknowledge that your openness relieved them from building reciprocity. You did not have to acknowledge that usefulness was being offered partly in exchange for the hope of becoming irreplaceable. The arrangement could feel loving while both expectations remained unnamed. When you stop participating, the hidden contract becomes visible through distress. They feel deprived of something they believed belonged to the relationship. You feel guilty for removing something you repeatedly gave without clear conditions. Both reactions reveal how thoroughly access had become entitlement on one side and obligation on the other. The guilt may intensify when you recognize that you helped teach the relationship to expect your availability. This can tempt you to conclude that changing now is unfair. Yet, participation in creating a pattern does not require permanent submission to it. Responsibility means seeing your part clearly, not preserving its consequences forever. You may owe honesty where honesty is possible. You do not owe unlimited emotional entry as compensation for every earlier yes. The past explains their expectation, but it does not decide your present availability without your participation. A relationship cannot become mutual if one person is forbidden to revise what they once gave unconsciously. Even so, revising the arrangement may feel cruel. A simple refusal becomes strangely difficult to state. You soften the sentence until its meaning nearly disappears. Then surround it with explanations, reassurance, and future possibilities. The old role tries to convert the limit into another act of service, ensuring that they feel sufficiently cared for, while receiving the answer you fear giving. Explanation can become a disguised attempt to control their reaction. If you find the perfect words, perhaps they will understand without feeling rejected. Perhaps they will recognize your goodness and release you from guilt. But a limit that depends on being approved is still governed by the person whose access it is supposed to regulate. Their disappointment may remain even when your words are careful. They may misunderstand you. They may tell a version of the story in which your distance appears sudden and unfair. The urge to correct that version can become stronger than the urge to reconnect. You want them to lose access without allowing them to lose the image of you as endlessly understanding. Here, another attachment becomes visible. You were not only protecting the relationship, you were protecting your place inside their mind. If you could remain the good, generous person, even while withdrawing, separation would cost less. Their disappointment threatens not only the bond, but also the identity through which you learned to remain acceptable. No explanation can guarantee that outcome. The moment you stop performing the old function, they may interpret you through the loss they feel. Their judgment may be incomplete, but repairing it may return you to the position in which their interpretation matters more than your experience. Sometimes being seen inaccurately is the price of becoming unavailable to an arrangement that required your disappearance. This does not require silence in every relationship. Some bonds can receive difficult truth and reorganize around it. Others respond to truth only as a barrier between them and what they want restored. The distinction emerges not from how emotional their reaction becomes, but from whether your separate reality is allowed to remain present after they hear it. You are beginning to learn that missing you is not enough. They must also be capable of encountering the conditions under which closeness no longer erases you. They may be sincere and still unable to do this. You may love them and still be unable to reopen the same arrangement. Neither truth needs to destroy the other. The old role cannot fully return because you have seen what it was protecting in both of you. Yet no new form of connection has been secured. There is only the unresolved space between affection and access, compassion and return, For once, uncertainty remains without your usefulness rushing in to close it. What you do inside that uncertainty will determine whether the relationship learns a new form or whether you once again disappear to preserve the old one. In that uncertainty, other people begin revealing what your former availability meant to them. Some become more attentive and ask what has changed. Others intensify the behavior that created the distance. They contact you more often, speak with greater urgency, or invoke the history between you as though previous access created a permanent claim. Their reaction may sound like concern. They tell you that you seem different, guarded, or unlike yourself, yet the self they recognize may be the one who rarely made them encounter a limit. When that version becomes less available, they experience the change personally because your former openness protected them from noticing how much the relationship depended on it. You may hear that you used to be kinder. What they often mean is that your kindness once arrived without requiring reflection from them. You made understanding easy. You absorbed the awkwardness, found the generous interpretation, and reopened contact before they had to consider what their behavior had cost. Your care allowed the relationship to continue without becoming more conscious. Some will genuinely miss you. They will remember your humor, your particular way of seeing things, and the ordinary moments that contained no rescue. They may also miss the access you provided. These forms of longing can exist together. The distinction appears in whether their missing leads to curiosity about your experience, or only pressure to restore their comfort. The deeper question is not whether they ever loved you. It is what their love required you to remain. Did closeness depend on your endless understanding? Did tenderness survive your refusal? Could the bond tolerate your fatigue, disagreement, and separate needs without treating them as a withdrawal of love? Someone who truly misses you can tolerate discovering that you are separate from the role they preferred. They may not respond perfectly. They may feel hurt, defensive, or confused, but your reality gradually enters the conversation. The goal stops being immediate restoration and becomes understanding what kind of connection can exist without repeating the previous arrangement. Someone focused primarily on lost access reacts differently. Your explanation is treated as a problem to overcome. Your limit becomes evidence of coldness. They listen for the point at which they can persuade you to resume your function. Even an apology may be shaped around regaining entry, rather than understanding why the entrance no longer opens in the same way. The difference is not always visible in one conversation. Promises can sound sincere, and emotional reunions can temporarily imitate change. What matters is what happens when no crisis is present and no reward is immediate. Do they remain curious after the intensity passes? Does consideration survive when your attention is no longer being offered as relief? You may feel impatient for a clear answer because ambiguity once kept you inside the pattern, yet forcing certainty can create another form of self-abandonment. You may label them entirely uncaring to make distance easier, or excuse everything to make closeness possible. Both conclusions remove the more difficult task of seeing the relationship as mixed, limited, and real. A mature recognition allows more than one truth. They may have cared for you within the limits of what they could perceive. They may also have relied on you in ways that diminished your personhood. You may have offered access freely and still have been hurt by what it became. No single truth must erase the others for your limit to remain valid. Your anger may return when you remember how much was taken for granted. Leaving the old arrangement does not require you to make the history gentle. It requires only that anger no longer be recruited to prove that the other person was entirely without feeling. The harm becomes clear without turning either of you into a simplified figure. The body begins showing you the difference between contact and obligation. A message appears, and the familiar tightening may still come, but now you notice it before composing the automatic response. Your breath has a chance to return. The pause does not tell you what answer to give. It reminds you that another person's reaching does not complete the decision. Sometimes you will answer. The difference lies in the source of the answer. You may respond because you have the willingness and capacity to be present, not because their need has suspended your right to choose. Care becomes an action you participate in consciously rather than a reflex used to protect your place in the relationship. At other times, you will not answer immediately. The silence may remain uncomfortable, especially when you know they are distressed. Yet, discomfort no longer proves that you are doing something wrong. It may simply mark the space where their emotional urgency once became your command before your own life had been consulted. They may interpret the delay as rejection, and you may want to send a long explanation to protect them from that conclusion, but being available for every interpretation is another form of access. It invites you back into responsibility for what they feel, what they assume, and how they narrate your absence. No boundary can survive if it must prevent all misunderstanding. This does not mean communication becomes unnecessary. Honest words may matter deeply. You can name what changed, acknowledge your previous participation, and describe what you can no longer offer. But explanation has limits. It can make your position clear. It cannot force another person to value your reality more than the access they are losing. Once this becomes visible, you stop measuring the success of honesty by whether they approve. They may understand and still feel disappointed. They may disagree and still respect the limit, or they may refuse the distinction entirely. Their response carries information about the relationship, but it no longer serves as the final authority over your decision. Guilt may remain after the conversation ends. You may replay every sentence, searching for unnecessary harshness. The old role will suggest that one more explanation could repair the discomfort. Yet repairing discomfort is not always the same as repairing relationship. Sometimes it merely restores the arrangement before either person has learned from its interruption. The space that follows can feel unusually quiet. You are no longer occupied by their recurring need. But freedom does not immediately fill the time with relief. You may feel unnecessary, restless, or strangely absent from your own day. The role gave structure to your attention. Without it, you encounter the parts of life repeatedly postponed whenever someone reached for you. The most difficult absence may not be theirs. It may be the absence of the role that once told you exactly how to matter. When no one is reaching for what you provide, a quiet emptiness appears where certainty once lived. That emptiness is not proof that you should return. It is the question the old arrangement kept hidden. Who are you when being needed is no longer the only reliable way to be chosen. Small preferences begin surfacing in that unclaimed space. You notice that you do not want to discuss a certain problem again. You enjoy an evening in which no crisis must be managed. You choose company in which conversation moves in both directions. These are not dramatic signs of transformation. They are ordinary evidence that your attention is becoming available to your own life. Mutuality may initially feel less intense than being needed. A person who respects your time may not pursue you urgently. They may ask whether you have space before sharing something difficult. Their care can seem emotionally quiet because it does not create the pressure that once made connection feel significant. You may mistake that quietness for a lack of depth. The old pattern taught you to recognize closeness through urgency, confession, and dependence. Reciprocal care often arrives through less dramatic gestures. Someone remembers what you said, notices your fatigue, accepts a refusal, or remains interested when you are not performing emotional labor. Receiving this kind of attention can be unsettling. You may search for what is expected in return or offer help too quickly, trying to restore the position you understand. Simply being considered leaves you more exposed than being useful, because there is no function standing between you and the question of whether your presence is genuinely wanted. This is where integration begins. The generous persona is not destroyed but returned to its proper place within a larger personality. You do not stop giving. Generosity remains part of you, but it is no longer permitted to represent all of you. Care no longer has to purchase permanence. Understanding no longer has to excuse repeated disregard. Availability no longer has to prove that your love is real. There will still be moments when the old bargain feels easier. Someone you love will reach out, and the familiar role will offer immediate certainty. You will know exactly how to respond and who to become. The newer position asks you to remain present with not knowing whether the connection can tolerate your full reality. You may occasionally reopen access more widely than you intended. Old arrangements often return through affection rather than pressure. A tender conversation lowers your guard, and the former rhythm briefly feels natural again. This does not erase what you have recognized. The important change is that you notice sooner when connection begins turning back into function and can correct without treating the moment as failure. You can care deeply and later realize that you exceeded your capacity. You can change your answer without constructing a moral defense. Your limits do not have to be flawless to be real. They become more trustworthy when they can respond to experience rather than protect a rigid new identity. Some relationships may slowly reorganize. The other person learns that access requires reciprocity, not as payment, but as recognition that another life exists beside their own. They begin approaching rather than entering. They ask rather than assume. The relationship may become less intense, yet more capable of containing two people. Other relationships may fade when the old entrance remains unavailable. Their disappearance can hurt even when it confirms what you suspected. You may grieve that the connection did not contain enough mutual interest to find another form. That grief does not prove that the old access should have continued. It honors what you wanted the relationship to become. You do not need to conclude that every person who leaves was consciously using you. Their departure may reflect limitation, a beat, discomfort, or an inability to relate outside the structure you shared. The result remains important. A connection unable to recognize your separate reality cannot be preserved by repeatedly making that reality disappear. Nor must every returning person be distrusted. Some will come back differently. Their words will be supported by patience, accountability, and an ability to hear no without treating it as punishment. You will not have to infer the change from longing alone. It will become visible in the way your limits remain part of the relationship after closeness resumes. This is the distinction the old role could not make. It treated being missed as proof of love because any return relieved the fear of being forgotten. Now you can allow longing to remain only one piece of evidence. You can ask what is being missed, what is being restored, and whether your personhood survives the reunion. The question becomes less about whether they come back and more about who is permitted to exist when they do. If reunion restores only their comfort while returning you to a function, then the distance has taught the relationship nothing. If both realities can remain present, return may finally mean something different. The answer may not be immediate. You may still feel tenderness when they call and relief when you do not respond. You may still wish they had learned to meet you before distance became necessary. Separation does not remove these contradictions. It allows them to exist without forcing you back into the arrangement that once resolved them at your expense. They are permitted to miss the access you gave. You are permitted to recognize that their longing does not create your obligation. Somewhere between their reaching and your reply, a choice now exists. The choice may remain difficult, sorrowful, and imperfect. You may still love them. You may still wish the relationship had learned another form. But reunion no longer requires your disappearance. Their longing remained, but it no longer decided your availability